So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another mechanical Backroads Arizona video. In this video, I'm going to be replacing the carburetor on my Onan 5500 Marquis Gold generator. That's in my 2007 Weekend Warrior toy hauler that I purchased used about 4 years ago. Ever since I got this toy hauler, this generator hasn't been running quite right. I'd have a hard time getting it started. And once I did get it to start, it would run for anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds and then shut down. And I'd have to restart it again, and I would have to do this several times in order to get the generator warmed up enough where it would stay running. Once I replace the carburetor, it fires right up and runs smoothly without a problem. The most common reason for you having to replace a carburetor on your generator, or any small engine for that matter that is carbureted, is that most people don't fire up their small engine and run it often enough. Once gasoline sits in that carburetor for too long of a period, the gasoline will start to gum up or gel up as it starts to go bad, which clogs the small orifices in the jets of the carburetor, which in turn causes the generator not to be flowing the right amount of gas, and therefore causing you to run rough or not run at all. So there is some easy solutions to prevent this from possibly happening on your generator. The first is, every couple weeks, like I do, go out there, fire up your generator, run it for 5 minutes, and then go ahead and shut it down. That moves the fuel that is just sitting in that carburetor, burns that up, and puts new fuel in it. Another thing you can do is add a fuel shutoff valve to the system, and there was actually one in the kit that I bought off of Amazon, and I put it in at the end of this video. A fuel shutoff valve enables you, if you know you're going to leave your generator sitting for a while, shut off that valve, then go ahead and fire up your generator and run it until it dies. Now, this isn't going to burn up all of the fuel in that carburetor, but what it might do is use up the fuel that's in the jets of that carburetor, which is those small orifices that are the most likely cause of getting clogged when you leave fuel in there too long. I've used this method at my work for over 10 plus years with a lot of small equipment that has carbureted engines on it, and it does help versus not doing it. The other option is use some fuel stabilizer to help prevent that gasoline from gelling up. Go with a higher octane fuel. Instead of running 87, use 91 octane. That has more additives to help prevent that. I also know a couple people that actually use avgas for the same reason I just described with using the higher octane fuel. This is obviously a far less common way to prevent this from happening because it's so much harder to get, but I do know some people that do it. So there's some options for you on how to prevent a carburetor from possibly going bad. However, this video is about changing out this carburetor, so let's get to it. Once gaining access to your generator, you will need to remove the side cover. By pulling the top of that side cover out towards you, then you will need to lift it up a little bit and it should come out without a problem. There is a rail that the bottom of that cover slides into, and then there are two snap-in clips that hold it at the top. After that, you will need to remove the air filter cover and the air filter in order to gain access to the carburetor. In order to remove the air filter cover, all you need to do is unsnap 3 metal clips. Once popping loose those 3 metal clips, then you're just going to bring the bottom of the air filter cover out a little bit and down as you do that. Then go ahead and remove the air filter just by pulling it off of the air filter housing. After that, you will need to remove the air filter housing. I ended up using a 1/4-inch ratchet with an extension and a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts that are holding the lower part of the air filter housing to the engine, and then the 2 nuts that are holding the upper part of the air filter housing to the carburetor. Then you should be able to remove the air filter housing by pulling it off of the carburetor first. You do need to be careful when removing this air filter housing because there is a blow-by hose going from the engine that attaches to the back of the upper part of that air filter housing. There's also a tube that comes off the bottom of that air filter housing that is for the intake air, and that will go into a tube that goes out to the bottom of the generator. You do need to be careful when going back together that you do get that in correctly, because if you do not, you'll be sucking hot air from the engine compartment instead of cold air from outside the generator. And then here's a little better view of that blow-by tube going from the engine that does attach to the back of the upper air filter housing. You will need to remove a couple wire connections from the electric choke and the bottom of the carburetor. The electric choke has 2 wire connections, and as much as possible I always put them back the same way I got them off, but in this case I don't think it really matters if you get them mixed up. I could not get the one from the bottom of the carburetor off by hand, so I did use a pair of needle nose to assist in pulling that connection loose. I used a 1/4-inch nut driver on a ratcheting screwdriver in order to remove the hose clamp for the fuel supply line to the carburetor. If that hose is struggling to come off that hose barb, sometimes it helps, instead of just pulling on the hose, to twist and pull at the same time in order to remove it. The only thing left is one linkage connection that goes from the governor on the engine up to the linkage on the carburetor. However, in order to get that linkage off, you will need to remove the carburetor from the studs on the engine. So right here you can see I'm carefully pulling it off and just leaning it off to the side for right now. You'll notice as I'm removing this carburetor that the outer shell of this generator has some rips in that fiberglass. I did not do that. I'm assuming somebody had to do some carburetor work in the past before I got it. I have a hard time believing this outer shell of this generator isn't big enough in order to remove that carburetor without having to break some of that fiberglass off. And instead of breaking it off, it would have been nice if they would have done a clean cut. But it is something you can consider if you're having a hard time getting that carburetor off of there, just to cut a little bit of that fiberglass out so you can access it and get it off without having to completely remove the generator and disassemble the housing around it. There is also a spring that is attached to that linkage as well, and I removed the spring first using a pair of needle nose, and then you can see the contour of that linkage. So just pivot the carburetor around the contour of that linkage in order to remove it from the engine. And even though you are using my video for a reference probably, I do recommend taking your own pictures of the way linkages and springs are on your carburetor or generator before removing them, so you have that for a reference as well. Once removing the carburetor, I also removed the gasket that goes between the carburetor and the engine, so I had it for a reference when looking this stuff up on Amazon to make sure the gaskets looked correct in the kit I was going to buy. Then I stuffed a rag inside the engine and inside the little blow-by tube, just so I didn't get any debris in there while I was waiting for my carburetor to be delivered so I could put it on. This is the carburetor I ended up getting off of Amazon, and I didn't have any issues with any of the gaskets or any of the parts. The carburetor fit well and it's running good so far. They do give you some measurements to check when ordering this off of Amazon, just to make sure that your carburetor is matching the one that is being supplied to you. And it is a good idea to check these items before ordering. You also want to take a look at your gaskets that were in front and behind the carburetor to make sure they look the same as the ones in the kit as well. Before installing the new carburetor, once I got it, I did put it right next to the old one on every angle and make sure everything was identical. The only difference between these two carburetors is instead of on the Onan one, it had some threaded fittings for the supply fuel line. This one had a molded piece of steel tubing pressed into the carburetor, which was not going to make a difference. I removed the rag that I used to protect the engine while I was waiting for the carburetor to come in. I removed a plastic spacer and another gasket that was between that spacer and the engine. When taking parts off like this, make sure you either take pictures or make note of the direction they were on there. Sometimes there's tiny holes in these gaskets or spacers that they need to go a certain direction. As a general rule of thumb, I just like to do that. The two gaskets and the spacer plate that were between the carburetor and the engine did not have any extra holes, so these ones really didn't matter, but a lot of times it does. Once cleaning any of the old gasket material off, I matched the old gasket that was in place there with the new one and slid it into place. Be careful you do not rip that gasket as you put it over the studs, because it is a tight fit. Then go ahead and slide your spacer back over those studs. You'll notice that both gaskets are identical in the picture that was on Amazon. However, when I purchased this kit, the second gasket was a little bigger and had some extra holes in it. However, I put my old gasket on top of that one and noticed that all the extra holes were outside of the sealing surface that the old one was using. So therefore, I did use that gasket and I have not had a problem. A lot of times when buying aftermarket parts instead of OEM, they make it to fit a variety of applications. If any of the extra holes that were in that gasket were inside the sealing surface, or the inside or outside of that gasket didn't match up with the spacer or didn't cover it properly, then I would have had to return it and found another kit. So just like when removing the old carburetor, I'm just pivoting the new carburetor around that control linkage from the governor to get it into place. It fought me a little bit more than removing the old one, because this one had a nice little plastic bushing to give me a nice tight fit on that linkage. Then I went ahead and hooked up the spring on that linkage, which just hooked around that linkage after it went through the bracket on the carburetor. Then slid that carburetor over the studs on the engine, being careful not to stretch the linkage or the governor bracket too far while doing so. Then slid my fuel supply line onto that hose barb and put the hose clamp and tightened it down. Then grab the gasket that goes between the carburetor and the air filter housing. This one is directional, so you need to make sure you paid attention to the way you took it off and put it on in the same manner. The old gasket was even labeled to assist to make sure it was not put on improperly. The new one was not, so it was just a matter of lining it up correctly. At this point, I do recommend hooking up all your electrical connections, the two on the electric choke and the one in the bottom of the carburetor. However, I forgot to do that, and I went ahead and installed the air filter housing at this point. I was able to get the electrical connections on after doing this. It would just be easier if you did it before. When installing this air filter housing, I thought it would be easier if I started it at the top first. However, I could not get the intake tube on that way, so I did have to put the intake tube on first and then just kind of leverage that housing of the generator in order for me to get the top part of that air filter housing up and into place. That blow-by tube should just slide right onto a little plastic tube that sticks off the back of that air filter housing, and you can feel behind that air filter housing to make sure it's on properly. Once you have verified that you're over the studs on the carburetor, the blow-by tube is on the tube off the back of the air filter housing correctly, and the lower intake is in that lower tube going out the bottom of the generator, then you can go ahead and start the two nuts on the carburetor and the two bolts that hold the lower part of that housing to the engine and tighten those down. Before installing the bolts in the air filter housing, make sure none of the metal bushings had fallen out. I don't know why or when, but one of mine did, and I had to put it back in place, give it a little tap with a hammer and a punch, and then go ahead and put my bolts in. Once you've tightened down the air filter housing, you can go in and install your air filter by just lining it up with that housing. When installing the cover, you will need to start out at an angle at the top to get the 3 tabs to line up with the 3 slots in the housing. Then straighten it out at the bottom and then snap the 3 metal clips over the air filter cover to hold it in place correctly. Make sure that you have a good snap on those metal clips. If those are loose in any way, shape, or form, you need to replace them or bend them back so they do hold that air filter cover tight, because that is the quickest way to dust an engine, and that could be very expensive if that air filter is not sealing correctly. I did go ahead and hook up my wires to the bottom of the carburetor and the electric choke because I had forgotten to do that before installing the air filter housing. If those spade connectors feel loose, pull that spade connector back off, take a pair of pliers, squeeze the female end of that spade connector a little bit to tighten it up, and then reinstall it to ensure you have a nice tight connection and it's not going to vibrate off over time. There is an altitude adjustment on this carburetor at the bottom, so just figure out where you're going to be for the most part and set it to that. If you do change altitude drastically, you can always pop off the hatch and adjust that when you get to where you're going as well. There's no tools required to make this adjustment. You're just going to turn that black plastic knob by hand where you need it. So as I said in the beginning of this video, this kit did have a fuel shutoff valve, and I did add it to my system along with one of these clear plastic fuel filters. Now, I did end up with one problem with doing what I'm just going to explain in this video, and I had to modify it a little bit. So please watch till the end of this modification so I can explain what I did, because this is a good idea to do. I just needed to change the way I did it a little bit. So right here, I am cutting the fuel supply line going to that carburetor and adding that shutoff valve. I didn't like the clamps that came in the kit, so I did use regular hose clamps. I put the fuel shutoff valve right before the fuel filter because if I do need to service that fuel filter in any way, shape, or form, I can just shut the fuel off. Even though for this setup, it's not really necessary to shut that fuel valve off to mess with the fuel filter because the generator is located higher than the fuel tank on the toy hauler. I'm not a huge fan of the way that that fuel line comes in right underneath that positive cable, even though it does have that nice protector on it. And I tried to keep it as far away from there as possible just because fuel and electricity aren't really a good mixture. So here is the end result of what I came up with. So right here you can see I'm firing up the generator, and then I went ahead and shut that fuel valve off. The generator ran for about a minute before dying out because of lack of fuel. Now keep in mind that you're never going to drain that fuel filter completely out of fuel by doing this. The fuel pump is between the shutoff valve that I just installed and the fuel tank. So basically you're stopping the supply of fuel to get to the carburetor, but the carburetor will not suck that line completely dry. A carbureted engine relies on the vacuum produced by the engine to suck the fuel through the orifices in the carburetor or jets in order to supply the engine to keep it running. Because we stop that supply of fuel, the fuel level is going to drop in the carburetor bowl, which is the reservoir. As that reservoir level drops, there's not enough fuel to make it into those orifices for that vacuum to suck that fuel through the carburetor to supply the engine, and therefore that engine is going to die out. Now after the engine dies, you will still have fuel in the carburetor bowl, but that's not a big deal. All we're trying to do is get the orifices in those jets of the carburetor ran dry, because that is where that fuel gums up the quickest. So right here, the engine's getting ready to stall out because of lack of fuel, and I am going to try and restart it, and you'll notice it will not start up, telling us that those orifices in the jets that are supplying the engine to make it run are ran dry, which is what we're trying to accomplish. And right here, you'll notice I was getting a code 36, which is a fuel supply issue that we caused by shutting that fuel valve off. So after I had done this modification, we had gone camping a couple times, and just to make sure everything was going okay, I did decide to flip up the generator housing and take the side panel off and take a look. And I noticed that the plastic fuel filter housing was starting to distort a little bit, which would obviously not be a good thing if it distorted to the point where it would start leaking and leaking fuel inside that very hot area. So I immediately took it out of there, and I just ran a fuel hose from the carburetor completely down and underneath the generator to the outside of the toy hauler basically. And then I put my fuel shutoff valve and a metal housing fuel filter, because once again, I don't really like plastic fuel filter housings. They are nice because of the fact you can see if you're getting fuel or not. However, for the reason that I just told you about is the reason I tend not to like them. They're just not as durable. So right here you can see I am cutting the fuel line right after the shutoff valve and adding a 1/4 inch inline metal fuel filter. Now when installing pretty much any inline fuel filter, it will have an arrow or an in and out labeled on that fuel filter. So make sure you get it going the right direction. Once I had the fuel filter tightened down, I just used a couple zip ties to hold that fuel line to a couple of the lines on the outside of that toy hauler. So here's one final look at that modification after changing it up a little bit. I honestly didn't think it was going to get that hot inside that generator to start distorting that plastic fuel filter housing. Obviously I was wrong. So for safety reasons, make sure you do not mount it inside that generator, just go underneath. It actually makes it easier to shut it on and off anyways. Now after putting this carburetor in, the generator fired right up, so I definitely rectified a problem. However, I was still having it shut down on me after 10 to 30 seconds or so, and I was getting a code 14 on the rocker switch on the generator. I think what had happened is because the carburetor was getting gummed up, the guy that had this thing before me was making adjustments trying to change the RPM range, and now that it was not clogged, it was doing a little too high of RPM, and I had to adjust the governor to reduce those RPMs back down a little bit, because a code 14 is basically a high frequency code, meaning possibly too high a RPM or too high a voltage. Once reducing those RPMs down a little bit by adjusting the governor, that code went away and it's been running fine ever since. It is nice having that clear fuel filter right where you can see it, because it can help you diagnose if you're starting to have a problem with your generator, because you can see the fuel flow going through that fuel filter. Now, instead of that metal fuel filter, you could put the plastic one down underneath, because then you don't have the heat created by that generator to possibly distort that plastic fuel filter. And that way you can still see whether or not you have fuel flow making it to your generator. So obviously, if you're trying to fire it up and it's not starting and you don't see any fuel there, you know you have a supply problem or a fuel pump that's gone bad and not giving any fuel to your generator. So that's going to about wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible, so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.